Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the former French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte became King of Sweden and Norway. He spent much of his reign improving his kingdoms economically and socially, just not politically. Anyone who wanted political reforms was met with the king's disapproval, not to mention legal proceedings. Still, he was surprisingly ineffective in his attempts to suppress Norwegian autonomy, and the Norwegian parliament, the Storting, and its ruling class of civil servants managed to do a good job of keeping Bernadotte out of Norwegian affairs. Today, we'll turn our attention to the former masters of Norway, the Danes. You might think that they'd be suffering a great trauma from having lost a whole kingdom. But they were doing remarkably well in the decades following the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, the period is generally considered to be one of the best in Danish history. Episode 129, Faith, Philosophy, Fairytales. Politically and economically, the first years of the 1800s were rough for Denmark. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the capital Copenhagen. The city had suffered major fires in both 1794 and 1795, when large parts of the center were destroyed, including the royal residence, Christiansborg Palace. Just as the Danes had cleared up most of the mess from those fires, the Brits showed up. As you may remember from episode 119, the British Navy attacked Denmark both in 1801 and 1807. After the latter attack, when the Brits bombarded Copenhagen, spreading death and destruction, Denmark joined the Napoleonic Wars on the French side against Britain. As understandable as that may have been, it turned out to be a mistake. The war was so expensive that Denmark went bankrupt in 1813. The following year, Norway was lost as well. All of this you already know, and since we've just spent several episodes dealing with what went down in Norway, I see no reason to dwell on it any further right now. When peace was restored to the radically reduced realm of the Oldenburg king on the throne in Copenhagen, his capital was in the worst state it had been in for generations. But not for long. The Danes went about reconstructing the war-torn city. Streets were widened, and new neoclassical buildings were erected along these new streets, creating a modern, airy, bright, but still charming atmosphere that still characterizes Copenhagen today. Some of the monumental buildings constructed in those years were inspired by strict, almost stern classic Roman architecture, for instance the old Copenhagen City Hall and the courthouse, and Copenhagen Cathedral, the Church of Our Lady. Christiansborg Palace was also rebuilt in the same style, but it burned down again in 1884, and the only thing that remains from the Golden Age palace is the chapel. But this Danish Golden Age wasn't all about architecture. It was also about music, painting, theater, sculpture, scholarship, and science. Unfortunately, the podcast format doesn't really lend itself to presenting painting and sculpture. Besides, if I'd want to cover it all, this would turn into an extremely long episode. Instead, I'll focus only on 3 Golden Age writers whose impact on their respective fields has been enormous in Denmark and in the entire world. At this time, German Romantic thinking was starting to influence Danish culture. We can even pinpoint this on one specific individual, namely a guy called Henrik Steffens, who had recently returned from Germany. In 1802, he gave a series of popular and well-attended lectures in Copenhagen explaining the Romantic idea, focusing on how everything was interconnected. Nature, history, the nation, all of it. At the time, Copenhagen was still a relatively small city with only 100,000 inhabitants. The intellectual class that would take an interest in such a thing as German Romanticism was even smaller, so it didn't take long until everyone who was anyone had heard about it. And since French Enlightenment seemed to have led them all down a path of chaos, war, and dry abstract thinking, they all embraced this cool new trend. Soon, Danish pens were churning out novels, poems, plays, philosophical tracts, and hymns inspired by Romanticism. One of the central participants in this literary movement was N.F.S. Grundtvig. He was many things, among them a poet, a pastor, an educator, a philosopher, and an author. NFS stands for Nikolai Frederick Severin, but people usually just refer to him as NFS Grundtvig, or, like I will, simply Grundtvig. without bothering with his initials. Life is just too short for 3 first-name initials. Grundtvig was a deeply religious man. It's true that in the early 1800s, most people were religious, at least nominally, but Grundtvig took his religion more seriously than most people. But Christianity wasn't his only passion in life, though. Thanks to his mother, who was very much into Old Norse sagas and traditions, he developed an interest in Old Norse culture, language, and religion. At the time, there was no name for the old pre-Christian religion in Scandinavia, so Grundtvig made one up. He called it Asatru, meaning belief in the Aesir, or loyalty to the Aesir being the old gods. And that's the name still in use today. Grundtvig got a degree in theology at Copenhagen University, and toward the end of his studies he also took up Icelandic, devouring the Icelandic sagas in the original language. Even though Grundtvig had already left Copenhagen by the time Henrik Steffens showed up to spread the word about German Romanticism in the capital, Grundtvig nonetheless heard about it, perhaps because Steffens was his cousin. Whether it was the familial connection or not, Grundtvig was profoundly influenced by the new ideas that Steffens taught. In 1808, Grundtvig returned to Copenhagen. There, he published an enormously popular book on Old Norse myths. The following year, he followed up this success with a play inspired by Old Norse culture. But then, in 1810, just as the conflict with Britain was heating up, Grundtvig had a sort of religious rebirth. He left the capital and went to work with his father, who was a priest in a small village some 90 kilometers south of Copenhagen. But just because he'd become super religious, that didn't mean he stopped writing. In 1812, he published a book about how humans throughout history had treated belief in God. The book was really a thinly veiled attack on contemporary Danish society, which Grundtvig felt didn't treat belief in God seriously enough. Unlike his previous works, this book was not well received. For some reason, people took offense at being called out for their lack of proper religiosity. The following year, his father passed away. Grundtvig requested to be allowed to take over his parish, but his request was turned down. I guess annoying the church establishment with a controversial book wasn't the best idea if he wanted to have a career as a priest. Instead of becoming a village pastor, Grundtvig continued writing. In the following years, he published books, poems, and articles. Many of the articles and poems were printed in the journal Dannevirke, where he was the editor and almost the only contributor. When Denmark lost the war, Grundtvig was active in the attempts to help Norway to avoid a union with Sweden. When that didn't work, he pushed the idea that it was the lack of faith among the Danes that had caused the wrath of God, and as a punishment, he'd taken Norway away from them. This time, people weren't annoyed, and his explanation was met with considerable enthusiasm in Copenhagen, at least among the common people. Again, the church establishment wasn't amused, and when Grundtvig a few years later published yet another book, this time arguing that theologians shouldn't be allowed to interpret the Bible because their interpretations were too academic and not spiritual enough, he was banned from preaching for 7 years. That meant he couldn't work as a priest in Denmark. To have something to do, Grundtvig started to study another dead Northern European language, this time Anglo-Saxon. He was greatly inspired by the spirituality found in the Anglo-Saxon literature, and he felt it contained important information about the early church in Northern Europe. In 1832, Grundtvig was finally allowed to work as a priest again, and a few years later he became the pastor of a modest hospital church in Copenhagen. That became his pulpit for the rest of his life, and he continued to preach there until a few days before he died. His sermons drew large crowds, and it didn't take long for Grundtvig to develop quite a following. With time, even the church establishment came around, and in 1861 he was elevated to the titular rank of bishop within the Church of Denmark, even though he never received a diocese to administer. In parallel, he continued to write and publish. The most important thing he wrote during these years, and arguably in his whole life, was a collection of religious poetry, later set to music as hymns, called Songwork for the Danish Church. All in all, Grundtvig wrote or translated no fewer than 1,500 hymns, and they became great hits, soon replacing the previously used music during Danish church services. But Grundtvig wasn't only a religious thinker with a soft spot for dead Northern European languages, he also held strong views about education. He felt that universities put too much emphasis on educating learned scholars, like theologians, I presume, Grundtvig thought that students instead should be prepared to take an active and practical role in society. They should learn practical skills as well as poetry and history infused with the proper patriotic spirit. He was also against the way things were taught in schools and at universities. Grundtvig promoted the romantic ideals of freedom, cooperation, discovery, and creativity. In his mind, nothing was more detrimental to the development of wisdom and compassion than sitting through boring theoretical lectures and cramming for harrowing exams. Grundtvig promoted the establishment of a whole new educational system with the so-called folk high schools. These institutions, which still exist today, generally focus on adult education without granting formal academic degrees. In the spirit of Scandinavian national romanticism, Grundtvig also dreamed of establishing a great Nordic university. He wanted it to be located in the middle of Scandinavia, which meant Gothenburg in Sweden as far as Grundtvig was concerned, so maybe geography wasn't a subject he'd spent too much time on. Either way, nothing came of that particular idea. NFS Grundtvig had an enormous influence on Danish culture in the 1800s. He's often credited with the shaping of Danish national consciousness, infusing it with Old Norse history as well as Christian spirituality. Still, he's not particularly well known outside of Denmark, not only because he wrote in Danish for a Danish audience, but also because you probably need to have a certain understanding of Danish culture and mentality to appreciate his writings. Internationally, Grundtvig is instead overshadowed by another Danish thinker who lived and worked during the Golden Age, namely Søren Kierkegaard. In the beginning of the 1800s, Danish philosophy was highly influenced by the German philosopher Hegel. This isn't a philosophy podcast, and I'm not even close to qualified to explain Hegel's thinking, but in brief, he was into objectivity, reason, and that sort of thing. Kierkegaard rejected all of that, instead putting the individual in the center, stressing the importance of personal choice. This made him a trailblazer for existentialism. Søren Kierkegaard was born in a well-to-do family in the Danish capital. It wasn't just well-to-do, it was also large. He was the youngest of 7 siblings. But the most interesting tidbit about the Kierkegaard family is probably that his mother, Anne, had started out as a maid working in the Kierkegaard household until she'd caught the eye of her husband-to-be. Kierkegaard studied at Copenhagen University, but traditional academic pursuits disappointed him. A bit like Grundtvig, he felt that the disciplines of theology and philosophy focused too much on dry theory and empty speculation. He decided that he was going to do something different. He wanted to focus on how an individual should act instead of what you should know, shifting the interest from the theoretical to the practical. To Kierkegaard, knowledge without action or choice was pointless. Since Kierkegaard prioritized the actual reality of the individual at the expense of abstract ideas, his writings reflect this, dealing with questions on how to live, the importance of making choices, and committing. Authenticity, duty, and love were central concepts in his philosophy. In the 1800s, it was common for people to use pseudonyms when publishing articles and books. Sometimes it was due to censorship laws, and sometimes because it was a convenient way to express opinions that perhaps you didn't fully support, or didn't want your neighbors to know that you supported. Kierkegaard was no exception, and he used loads of pseudonyms, especially during the early years of his career. Some of the pseudonyms he used included such gems as Johannes de Silencio, Nicolaus Nota Bene, Hilarious Bookbinder, Johannes Climacus, Anticlimacus, and P.C. Kierkegaard. I'm not sure who he thought he was fooling with that last one. Whatever name he published under, Kierkegaard published a lot, both essays, or discourses as he liked to call them, and books. These titles include The Concept of Anxiety, 3 discourses on imagined occasions, and Concluding Unscientific Postscript. He not only wrote at breakneck speed, he also edited and published these texts on his own, without an editor or publisher, so basically self-publishing. Like most other self-publishing authors, he sold few books. He didn't seem too bothered about it though, and noted in one of his books that he expected few people to have the energy to drudge through it. And in other texts, he made references to his one reader, who might be interested in his writings. That was a slight exaggeration, and Kierkegaard knew it, because he was aware that his ideas were getting attention. Not always positive attention, but still. The book he's most famous for is no doubt Either Or, published in 1843. Here, Kierkegaard once again used a pseudonym, pretending that the book was edited by some guy called Victor Eremita. The book itself is a number of essays supposedly written by two quarreling anonymous authors, called A and B. These two alphabet characters fight about faith and marriage with a short detour into literary and musical criticism to spice things up. The whole book ends with the editor telling A and B to stop arguing. As for the contents of Either Or, it's a broadside against Hegelian philosophy. Kierkegaard begins with the rhetorical question, are passions the pagans of the soul, reason alone baptized? He then goes on to write about how one should live, touching on faith, hope, love, peace, pride and selfishness, important aspects of life that Kierkegaard argues reason can't help us to understand or handle. It should be noted, though, that Kierkegaard didn't think reason was unimportant. He just argued for a balance between thought and passion, claiming that without passion, endless reflection is pointless. But he was Scandinavian, after all, so he didn't mean anything as vulgar as external displays of passion. No. He wanted people to focus on their internal passion, without showing anything to the world. Like Grundtvig, Kierkegaard also had a lot to say about religion, and strong views on religious life in Denmark. Kierkegaard had a particular approach to both faith and love. He was against sitting around waiting for God to kindle the spark of faith. Instead, Kierkegaard argued that the individual should make a choice. Of course he did. The individual should resolve to believe and then to act as a believer. With time, faith would come. Fake it till you make it, basically. By the way, he viewed love the same way. According to Kierkegaard, real love takes work. It's based on choice and action. Anyway, Kierkegaard also objected to theologians or members of the church hierarchy trying to prove that Christianity was true. He didn't even think that the church should bother to defend Christianity against attacks. Instead, it should help potential believers to make a leap of faith, encouraging them to believe that God loves them and that he has a plan for every single human being. Faith, Kierkegaard argued, cannot be based on evidence. It can't be proven. Sitting around waiting for proof before committing to religion would be as foolish as waiting for that divine spark. People should commit to religion anyway, without certainty. In Kierkegaard's view, faith has doubt built into it. Without doubt, faith would have no substance, no worth. He pointed out that someone who, on a purely intellectual level, doesn't understand that Christian doctrine is inherently dubious, doesn't have true faith at all. He's merely a credulous simpleton. As far as organized religious life was concerned, Kierkegaard didn't like the way Christianity was practiced in Denmark. He criticized the fact that the Church of Denmark was basically a part of the state apparatus, and that the state regulated religious life in law. Kierkegaard felt so strongly about this that he spent the last years of his life attacking the church in a flood of newspaper articles and self-published pamphlets. In Kierkegaard's view, the church as a state organ focused more on increasing its membership numbers than the faith of its members, since more people meant more money and more influence in society. This was a corrupt system, undermining the basic tenets of Christianity. He claimed regular congregants were discouraged to think for themselves and instead were urged to accept what they were told. It encouraged a herd mentality among the congregants where religion was reduced to little more than a fashion, adhered to by what Kierkegaard called unbelieving believers. This one-man crusade against the church was quite stressful for Kierkegaard, and one day he suddenly collapsed in the street. He was hospitalized, but his brush with death did not soften his opinion on organized religion. For the duration of his hospitalization, he refused to take communion from the hospital priest. He rejected the validity of the sacrament since he considered the priest to be a political official and not a true representative of God. In the end, he never recovered and died in 1855. His nephew, Henrik Lund, caused a bit of a scene at his funeral by protesting that it was handled by the church. Lund argued that Kierkegaard would never have agreed to a Church of Denmark funeral if he'd been alive, and he was probably right about that. Nonetheless, Lund was fined for his outburst. Still, Kierkegaard's criticism influenced the church. Some changes, based on the philosopher's criticism, were actually implemented. The church scrapped the rule saying that congregants had to attend the church in the parish where they lived. They were now free to worship in any church belonging to the Church of Denmark. Everyone still had to attend church, though. 2 years later, they went even further and abolished compulsory baptism of all newborns. They even dared to discuss whether it was such a good idea that the king was the head of the church. But in the end, they didn't change that. Kierkegaard had strong opinions about other matters than organized religion as well. He was, for instance, dead set against women's liberation. Apparently, he felt equal rights for women had gone way too far in the 1800s. In his works, he did stress that men and women were equal before God, and that women were, in fact, capable of the same spiritual development as men, but they just shouldn't have the same rights. In general, Kierkegaard was stingy with handing out rights, not only to women. He argued against democracy, describing it as the most tyrannical form of government. His ideal form of government was, shockingly, absolute monarchy of the kind they had in Denmark during the Golden Age. He described the Danish public as the most dangerous of all powers and the most pointless. It should probably not come as a great shock to learn that he also railed against the media. He characterized it as the most wretched and contemptible of all tyrannies. His strong opinions on the subject may have been influenced by the satirical press making fun of his writings, his appearance, and the way he spoke. During his lifetime, and in the first decades after his death, Kierkegaard was almost unknown outside of Scandinavia. This never bothered Kierkegaard, though, not necessarily because he was a naturally modest person, but because he was convinced that he'd eventually gain enormous fame, and that people would one day pore over his discourses, books and diaries, trying to understand his thinking. And he turned out to be right, even though it took more than 50 years after his death for him to become famous. It wasn't until the early 1900s that philosophers elsewhere started to take an interest in him, and he was translated into French, German, and other European languages. By the 1930s, he'd become a quite important thinker, influencing philosophy, theology, and even literature. 20th century existentialist philosophers drew heavily on Kierkegaard when they formulated their own ideas, even though most of them, like Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre, didn't care much about Kierkegaard's religious musings. But with all due respect to Grundtvig and Kierkegaard and his posthumous fame, the best-known author from the Danish Golden Age is no doubt Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote many different things, novels, poems, plays, and travelogues, but the thing everyone knows about him is that he's the father of the modern fairy tale. I bet very few of you have ever seen a play or read a travelogue written by Andersen. I know I haven't. He wrote a grand total of 156 fairy tales, some inspired by ancient myths or traditional folk tales, and some he made up from scratch. They've been translated into more than 125 languages, an achievement few authors have ever come close to. Many of the stories are still read and loved by parents and children today, almost 200 years after they were written. Among the most popular of his fairy tales are such hits as The Emperor's New Clothes, The Little Mermaid, and The Ugly Duckling. Andersen was born in 1805 in the city of Odense on the island Funen. When he was 11 years old, his father died, and 2 years later, his mother remarried. Andersen was sent away to a school where he received a basic education, but also had to work to support himself. He only stayed there for a year, and at the mature age of 14, he moved to Copenhagen to try his luck as an actor in the capital. I know it sounds like a recipe for disaster, but actually he got a job at the Royal Danish Theatre thanks to his pleasant soprano voice. Unfortunately for Andersen, though, his voice changed soon after he got that sweet gig, and he was fired. A colleague encouraged the distraught Andersen to focus on writing instead, and so he did. In 1829, Andersen's career as an author took off, and he enjoyed quite a lot of success with several books no one remembers today. In May 1835, Andersen's first fairy tales were published. His Fairytales Told for Children contained 9 stories and was published in 3 installments. The first batch included The Tinderbox, Little Claus and Big Claus, The Princess and the Pea, and Little Ida's Flowers. The first 3 were based on folk tales, but the last one Andersen had come up with on his own. Ida, from the title, was the daughter of one of Andersen's early benefactors. Andersen did this from time to time, including people he knew in his stories. If he didn't like you, you'd run the risk of showing up as a villain in one of his fairy tales. The second installment of his fairy tales was published 5 months later, in December. It included The Naughty Boy, The Traveling Companion, and Thumbelina. The Naughty Boy was inspired by a collection of ancient Greek poems on the topics of wine, beauty, sex, and the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and orgies. Perhaps not the most obvious subject matter for children's stories, but what do I know? Then there was an unforeseen break in the publishing of the stories. The reason was that Danish reviews of the first 2 booklets hadn't been enthusiastic, to say the least. The critics disliked the chatty, informal style and apparent immorality, since at the time children's literature was expected to educate rather than to amuse. Incidentally, one of the people who didn't appreciate Andersen was Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote a whole book about how clueless Andersen was. The sensitive Andersen took the criticism to heart and abandoned fairy tale writing for a while. It took him a whole year to muster the courage to finish the 3rd installment, which hit the Danish bookstores in April 1837. And it was a good thing he got back on track, because the 3rd and last booklet contained the evergreens The Little Mermaid and The Emperor's New Clothes. But Andersen was still nervous about the whole project, and right up until the day of printing he tinkered with the manuscript. One of the last editions was actually the little child who calls out the emperor in public for not wearing any clothes. I can't imagine the story would have had the same impact if it hadn't included that ending. The Danish critics may have been skeptical, but these fairy tales, especially The Little Mermaid, made Andersen famous internationally. The encouragement from abroad fortified the sensitive author enough to continue writing, and in 1838 and 1845 he published 2 more series of fairy tales. By now, even the Danes started to appreciate him, and when he was invited to visit the king, whose children loved his stories, Andersen had definitely established himself on the Danish literary scene. He became a national treasure and was even awarded a yearly stipend to be able to write his fairy tales without worrying about money. In the summer of 1847, Andersen went to England, where he was feted like the literary superstar he was. The Countess of Blessington, who herself was a writer, invited him to her parties, where Andersen met a whole bunch of British intellectuals. One of them was the author Charles Dickens. Andersen was completely starstruck and noted in his diary that he was so happy to see and speak to England's now living writer whom he loved the most. The 2 authors struck up a friendship, and a few years later Andersen went back to England to visit Dickens. But that visit went sideways. Andersen enjoyed his stay so immensely that he extended it far beyond what the Dickenses had expected or wanted. After 5 weeks, Dickens had no choice but to ask Andersen to just leave. Imagine how annoyed a Brit would have to be that blunt. Dickens must have been boiling inside. The baffled Andersen returned home, but he clearly hadn't grasped the severity of his social faux pas, because he continued to bombard Charles Dickens with letters that, to Andersen's confusion and frustration, went unanswered. On top of his inability to read social cues, Andersen was also struggling with his sexuality, experiencing attraction to other men, obviously a big no-no in 19th century Denmark. One of his first infatuations was his childhood friend, Edward Collin, but he rebuffed Andersen. Later, he wrote in his memoirs that he found himself unable to respond to this love, and this caused the author much suffering. Andersen was luckier with the hereditary Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, with whom he did have a relationship, writing in his diary how he cuddled and kissed the Grand Duke. Later, Andersen moved on to a dancer called Harold Scharf, who supposedly inspired the fairy tale The Snowman. They met when Andersen was already a famous and established man in his 50s, and in the winter of 1861-1862 they entered into a relationship. In his diary, Andersen described this as his erotic period. Romantic affiliations between men were illegal, obviously, but Andersen wasn't able to keep a low profile about his relationship with the young dancer. People in his social circle found it both improper and ridiculous, both due to the same-sex thing and the considerable age gap. In November 1863, Scharf broke it off by ghosting Andersen. They still moved in the same circles though, and Andersen, as always bad at reading the room, tried to get back together with the dancer several times, but was shot down. At this point, I feel duty-bound to clarify that not everyone accepts that Andersen ever had sex with other men. Two scholars from the Hans Christian Andersen Center at the University of Southern Denmark have rejected the idea. They admit that there were ambivalent elements in Andersen's emotional life, but they deny that he ever could have had a physical relationship with a man because, as they write, it would have been entirely contrary to his moral and religious ideas. Now, I don't want to sound flippant, but it's not entirely unheard of that religious people engage in something that goes against their moral and religious ideas, so I wouldn't characterize it as an ironclad argument. In all fairness, it should be noted though that Andersen also courted women, but he tended to go for women he couldn't have, such as the world-famous Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind. Once, as she was boarding a train, he gave her a letter in which he proposed marriage to her. She wasn't interested in marrying the famous but socially awkward author though, and clarified that she viewed him more like a brother than a love interest. Andersen reacted by using Jenny Lind as the basis for the description of the evil Snow Queen from the fairy tale with the same name. In 1872, when he was 67 years old, Andersen fell out of bed and was badly injured. He never fully recovered from his injuries, but it wasn't the fall that did him in. Instead, when the doctors examined him, they discovered that he had liver cancer. He died in 1875 at the age of 70. Before he died, when he knew he didn't have long to live, he started to plan his own funeral, asking that the music should be adapted to make it easy for children to walk after the funeral procession. So there you have it, 3 important representatives of the Danish Golden Age. It was a period that saw impressive developments, not only in philosophy and literature, but also in painting, sculpture, architecture, music, ballet, and science. But there's one field conspicuously absent from that list, and that's politics. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the old Danish political system, with an absolute monarch that was the font of all power in the kingdom, remained intact. Unfortunately for the supporters of the old order, no matter how splendid the Golden Age was, it didn't distract the Danes from the fact that they lacked all political freedoms. They saw what had happened in Norway, and there were quite a few Danes who envied the Norwegian constitution of 1814. And when the short-lived King of Norway, Prince Christian Frederick, succeeded his half-cousin as King of Denmark in 1839, the hopes that he'd do for Denmark what he'd done for Norway was kindled. Next time, we'll see how that played out. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. Nowadays, you can even look up the Scandinavian History Podcast on YouTube. As always, I look forward to hearing from you.